The prairies are likely one of the most heavily damaged ecosystems in North America. Why? Lands once filled with a variety of short or tall grasses, many different animals from iconic huge bison to small rodents have collided with humans. Agriculture, ranching, hunting, urban expansion, and other human activities have caused lasting damage to this once thriving landscape. All this led to degrading. Across a large part of North America, the prairies no longer look like they used to. Salvation seems to lie in changing the way we use nature for our own benefit. There's also another way. People started letting loose little dogs on the transformed prairies. Dogs? Nope, not those ones. These ones. Prairie dogs. How did such a tiny creature end up being the key to rescuing a legendary ecosystem? Let's find out. Back in the day, there used to be a ton of prairie dogs all across North America. They lived in the West, from Canada down to Mexico. It's hard to say how anyone counted prairie dogs before the year 1800, but there's info suggesting more than 5 billion of them roamed the western lands. Why did the year 1800 become a turning point? You can probably guess. European settlers showed up. And really, the story of almost every animal species in North America is closely tied to them. Hunting them for their fur isn't the reason prairie dogs became fewer in number. What really made the difference was the growth of farming and ranching. Prairie dogs are animals that do best in the legendary North American prairies. The people came along and started turning that land into farmland, so prairie dogs just ended up with less and less space to live in. When it comes to livestock farming, prairie dogs really got on people's bad side. Their homes are burrows they dig in the ground. These can have lots of chambers, each with its own purpose, like a nursery, a sleeping spot, or a place to hibernate. Naturally, such underground homes are a way to stay safe from predators. However, all this didn't really bother the ranchers. They were worried about something else. Prairie dog burrows are holes scattered all over the fields. A cow or a horse could easily step into one and get injured, badly enough that it could even die. Besides, people often said those little prairie dogs were big-time grass munchers, and grass, after all, feeds the herd. So yeah, it became an issue. Ranchers started wiping out prairie dogs actively, both by regular shooting and using poison. However, that wasn't the end of the prairie dog's troubles, since in 1900, trading ships from Asia brought over rats that passed the plague on to North American rodents. It can wipe out entire colonies in a short amount of time, sometimes in just a week. This, first of all, led to a serious drop in prairie dog numbers all by itself, and secondly, pushed people to go after them even more eagerly, since there was now this idea that the poor rodents might spread the plague to both humans and livestock. It's worth saying that the mass extermination of these animals in North America kept going until the end of the last century, and in many cases, the authorities actually helped make that happen. One of the most telling examples is South Dakota in the 1980s, where over 494,000 acres of prairie dog land were poisoned because of a state order. That land was home to one of the largest remaining populations in the U.S. Lately, on top of all the other problems small animals face, there's been the never-ending spread of cities and suburbs. Built-up areas kept expanding, leaving less and less space for prairie dogs to live in. Naturally, the overall number of animals dropped. They just had nowhere to go. In the end, out of the 5 billion prairie dogs that roamed North America around the year 1800, by the 2000s, about 96 to 98% had been poisoned, shot, or pushed out because of farming and urban sprawl. Their habitat, in turn, shrank to just about 5%. But you know what's the most upsetting for these little animals? The deliberate extermination by humans was totally unnecessary. Cows and horses, as research has shown, very rarely break their legs because of the prairie dog burrows. As for the plague, it turned out that since 1949, only 23 out of nearly 500 cases of livestock infection were linked to prairie dogs. Scientists concluded that the plague is just as dangerous for these rodents. They're not carriers, but victims of the disease spread by fleas. As a result, prairie dogs were wiped out by mistake, nearly entirely. Meanwhile, people realized that prairies without prairie dogs often face serious problems. Let's move to Arizona. In the past, one of the prairie dog species, the black-tailed ones, was widespread across the local prairies, but since the 1960s, they've been systematically poisoned. The situation was similar to what happened in many other places across North America. However, over time, it became clear that this species is crucial to the prairie ecosystem. That's why in 2008, Arizona Game and Fish, or AZGFD, BLM, state lands, and several private landowners kicked off a Reintroduction project. In southern Arizona, where the prairies were once full of life, 78 individuals were released. arriving from New Mexico. After that, around 500 black-tailed prairie dogs came from New Mexico to Arizona. As a result, according to the project participants working on the restoration, there are now at least 300 individuals in southern Arizona. The species occupies about 36 acres of land that had been withering away due to the absence of prairie dogs. The population recovery is in full swing, but there's more to come because the prairie dogs will be breeding. Now, to understand what they can achieve in Arizona by increasing the number of prairie dogs, let's head a bit southeast to the territory of Mexico, specifically state of Chihuahua. There used to be a lot of prairie dogs there too, but the same culling through hunting and poisoning happened, as well as habitat destruction due to agriculture. As a result, part of the state's land was taken over by mesquite in 1987 when the prairie dogs were almost gone. It's a plant that can find water even where there's not much of it. This ability comes from its roots, which can go deep into the ground. On top of that, the shrub attracts small animals that eat the surrounding grasses. As a result, large areas of the Chihuahua state prairies turned into deserts and semi-deserts. As a result, biodiversity was greatly reduced. Then the altered areas, which had once lost almost all of their prairie dogs, began to get them back thanks to the efforts of some dedicated people. After a while, the mesquite disappeared. It just so happened that prairie dogs really don't like this shrub because it blocks their view of the horizon, where they can spot predators, so they try to get rid of it as much as possible. As it's claimed, within a year, prairie dogs are able to destroy most of these plants. Together with the mesquite, the prairie dog has made the once barren lands disappear. Vast areas have once again become prairies. And these are prairies filled with a huge variety of animals and insects. As witnesses to the changes that have taken place in Mexico have stated, not long after, in a place where once there was desert, you can see badgers. Golden eagles are a bird that supposedly doesn't appear often in Mexico, particularly in Chihuahua. However, after the appearance of prairie dogs, the bird showed up as well. When researchers drove through the area, which was transforming from desert into what now looks like a prairie, they managed to spot more than 20 of those eagles in a single day. Thanks to small but very numerous prairie dogs, lifeless areas may gradually return to their original prairie state. Not just visually, but also in terms of biodiversity. All because prairie dogs are a keystone species, meaning they have an impact on the ecosystem that's way bigger than their numbers. In short, there aren't many of them, but they're capable of changing everything. That's what happened in Mexico. The same thing will happen, or has already happened, in the species recovery area in Arizona. Unfortunately, there isn't much data on the reintroduction process there, but looking at Mexico, we can assume Arizona will see the same positive changes. And now let's get back to the mesquite that prairie dogs don't like. It's worth mentioning that this is not the end of the relationship between the shrubs and the prairie dogs. They absolutely can't stand any grass that's too long or trees, which is why their habitat consists of prairies and meadows. Trees simply don't grow in such areas because they're destroyed by little creatures while they're still young, never having the chance to grow into something more stable and strong. Moreover, prairie dogs dig burrows, which helps grass grow and renews the topsoil with rich minerals and other nutrients. Scientists say this is crucial for soil quality and even agriculture, which is why prairie dogs have been pushed out of their habitats. According to different sources, around 150 different species of animals depend on prairie dogs. In other words, if there are prairie dogs, other animals show up, but if there are no prairie dogs, the other prairie inhabitants are completely or almost completely absent. For example, do you know about the legendary American bison? They were also hunted to extinction by humans, but this time for their fur and all the other things you can get from these animals. As scientists have figured out, on grazing lands with prairie dogs, bison are more likely to graze. Along with them, you might spot animals like pronghorns and mule deer. They aren't bothered at all by the fact that prairie dogs dig burrows that could break their limbs. Speaking of burrows, these underground homes are favorite places for other species to live. For instance, a golden-mantled ground squirrel might well choose a prairie dog burrow as its own home. And this is an owl? Yes, a burrowing owl, which prefers not to dig but just settle in the burrows of prairie dogs. On top of that, the biodiversity of the area where the prairie dogs live increases for another reason. Rodents are the favorite prey of many predators. For example, the black-footed ferret often stands out, with 90% of its diet consisting of prairie dogs. Due to the decline in prairie dog populations, the black-footed ferret was declared completely extinct in 1979. However, in 1981, a remnant wild population was discovered in Wyoming. Then, active attempts to reintroduce the ferret in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico took place from 1991 to 2009, and by 2015, there were more than 200 individuals in 18 populations in South Dakota, Arizona, and Wyoming. Over the years of research, ecologists figured out that the black-footed ferret population could not be restored without first restoring the prairie dog population. That's why in many areas it all began with the reintroduction of the stars of our video today, and only afterward were the ferrets introduced, as they feed on them. Apart from ferrets, prairie dogs are the main diet for species like the swift fox, golden eagle, red-tailed hawk, American badger, and coyote. So if prairie dogs show up, you'll definitely find one of these species around, or maybe even all of them. It's also worth noting that these small prairie dwellers are such an important part of the diet for many species that you won't find them, even on nearby meadows where there are no prairie dogs. However, even those species that use burrows but don't eat our prairie dog heroes will still prefer places where prairie dogs live. All of this was uncovered during research. Ecologists ran an experimental project on reintroducing prairie dogs in the Sevieta National Wildlife Refuge located in Socorro County, New Mexico. They set up 22 acres of grasslands and released prairie dogs there. This area is marked in blue. Right next to it, there are identical grasslands where not a single member of the species was introduced. Those are marked in yellow. Burrowing owls and rabbits are the species that showed up almost right away on the same land. That's how strong their urge is to settle into already made burrows. Birds of prey and badgers, those are the species that followed their favorite prey, ignoring grasslands where it wasn't around. When the research wrapped up, scientists came to a clear conclusion: prairie dogs play a key role in restoring the prairie ecosystem. Now we're moving to Colorado, to a pretty unusual place in the context of today's topic, the U.S. Army's chemical depot in Pueblo. It used to store 2,613 tons of mustard agent and about 780,000 munitions, which made up roughly 7% of the U.S.'s original stockpile of chemical materials. In the spring of 2015, they started destroying all the stockpiles, and all the work was wrapped up in 2023. Still, it kinda looks like a reason why the biodiversity in this area shouldn't be all that rich. After all, stockpiles like that are no joke. They really can affect the environment. That said, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service says the chemical depot covers some of the oldest untouched shortgrass prairie habitats in Colorado. Moreover, the area is home to a wide range of wild animals, including burrowing owls, foxes, hawks, golden eagles, coyotes, and badgers. Recognize any animals on that list that we already saw in today's video? The ones that rely on prairie dogs? Yes, some of the local wildlife only exists thanks to prairie dogs, who either offer a home in their burrows or end up as food. Surprisingly, the trouble isn't coming from warehouse chemicals, but from a plague outbreak in 2015 and 2016 that really hit local species hard. And yeah, prairie dogs were, of course, the first to suffer. In 2019, a large-scale project was launched to relocate prairie dogs in order to restore historic populations of this key species. It wrapped up in 2023 and was a collaboration between the U.S. Army, Colorado Parks and Wildlife Department, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Wildlife Service, the Colorado Department of Transportation, and the Prairie Dog Coalition. The participants were trapping prairie dogs from land owned by the Pueblo Chemical Depot, as well as from privately owned land, and then relocating the key species to a designated area. Of course, just like in other projects, some of those who once left after most of the prairie dogs were wiped out have returned to the area, plus the local prairies have gotten healthier. Still, that's not enough for the project team. The main goal is to bring back the black-footed ferrets, whose diet, let's not forget, is 90% prairie dogs. So hopefully it'll all work out. By the way, it's worth pointing out that prairie dogs are interesting to scientists not just because they're a keystone species, but for another reason too. They bark. Yes, the animals you're seeing on your screen right now have one of the most advanced communication systems in the animal kingdom. Imagine this. After tons of research, scientists have figured out that prairie dogs use a complex system of vocal communication to describe specific predators. Prairie dog calls actually carry detailed info about what the predator is, how big it is, and how fast it's coming. And if you think that the animal's reaction after receiving a signal that a predator is approaching is always just diving into a burrow, that's not even close. Look, if the prairie dogs get an alarm signal that a hawk is swooping down toward the colony, all the ones in its flight path dive into their burrows, while those outside the path just stand and watch. If there's a coyote threat, prairie dogs move toward the burrow entrances and stand just outside, keeping an eye on the predator, while the ones inside come out to stand and watch. A human showing up near the colony got a special kind of reaction. All the colony members instantly rushed into their burrows without bothering to watch, and this behavior is completely justified. Years of extermination are showing their effect on how prairie dogs react to humans. It doesn't even make a difference that the key species has now been recognized and is being actively restored to bring the prairies and barren lands back to how they were long ago.